In Parshas B'Ha'aloscha, there are two verses that are familiar to us from the davening before and after Kriyas Torah. Vayihi ben Aharon, Vayomer Moshe. Here are the verses. It's in Perek Yud, Psukim Lamed Hey Lamed Vav. That's 10, 35, 36. Vayihi ben Ha'aron, Vayomer Moshe. And it came to pass when the ark journeyed forth, and Moshe said, Kuma Hashem, v'yafutzu oivecha, v'yonusu misanecha miponecha. Arise, O God, so that your enemies may be scattered, and so that those who hate you flee from before your face. And in 36, Lamed Vav, Uvnucho Yomar, and when it gently came to rest, he said, Shuva Hashem Revavosa Yisrael. Return, O God, the myriads of the thousands of Israel. So there's something unusual, besides the actual meaning of the passage, there's something unusual in the formatting of this passage. Let me show you that in the Chumash right here. Here's the passage. Vayihi ben Ha'aron, Vayomer Moshe, etc. And here is a letter that's unusual. It's a backwards nun. And here at the close of those two verses is another letter that's unusual. Well, it's the same letter that's unusual. It's another backwards nun. This is a little unusual. And the question is, why? Why is it separated by two backwards nuns? They're almost like funky brackets. Rashi raises the question, and he says, without asking the question, he answers it. The question is, why the funky nuns? And he says, Asolo simon milafanov umila acharov. He made a mark before it and after it, lomar, to say, she'ein ze mekomo. This is not the proper place for these verses. V'lama nichtav kan. So why is it written here? Kedei lahafsik bein pur anus lepur anus. To separate between, one might call pur anus to be, one might call pur anus punishment, but you might also call it bad things. K'de'isa b'chol kisvei HaKodesh, as it says in the Gemara of Shabbos. So the Gemara of Shabbos observes this and asks, what are the two bad things? What are the two terrible episodes? The pur anus, the dangerous circumstances that occurred to the Jews in the desert. The Gemara says that the second pur anus, the second tragic or evil occurrence, is the verse that immediately follows, which is Perek Yud Aleph, Pasuk Aleph, 11:1. Vayihi ha'am k'mis onanim ra ba'oznei Hashem. The people were as though they were mourning over themselves. They were bad in the ears of God. Vayishma Hashem vayichar apo, and Hashem heard it, and his anger kindled. Vativar bam eish Hashem vatochal b'ktzeam hamachana. And God's fire broke out against them and devoured at one edge of the camp. So they were in mourning. They were complaining, and the people later on the Chumash describes how the people really longed for meat, and they got meat, and then it didn't end well. So that's the second pur anus. That's the pur anus that follows the bracketed material. What's the one that precedes it? So the Gemara says that it's two verses immediately preceding that, which is Vayis'u mehar Hashem derech shloshes yomim. And they sojourned from the mountain of God a journey of 3 days. Va'aron bris Hashem nosea lifnehem derech shloshes yomim losur lehem menucha. And the Ark of God's covenant traveled ahead of them a 3 days journey to seek out a resting place for them. So, what exactly is bad about that? So, the language of the Gemara describing that is Vayis'u mehar Hashem. They traveled from the mountain of God. Omer of Chama bereb Chanina. So this is the Gemara in Shabbos. Shesoru me'acharei Hashem. When it says Vayis'u mehar Hashem, they traveled from the mountain of God. The Gemara is saying that they deviated from God. Soru me'acharei Hashem. And Rashi, and Tosfos gives a colorful explanation from the Medrash Tanchuma. He says, Yilamdenu shesoru me'acharei Hashem, they strayed from God, b'ma shenosu mehar Sinai, ketino kayotze mibeis hasefer, shaboreach lo v'holech lo. Like a child, they departed from the mountain of God, which was Mount Sinai, like a child who leaves school and he runs and just keeps on going. That's what Bnei Yisrael did from Har Sinai. Kach hayu borchin mehar Sinai derech shloshes yamim lifnei shalamdu harbe Torah lefi shalamdu harbe Torah misinai, because they learned a lot of Torah on Sinai. Amar Kadosh Baruch Hu, the Almighty said, Lo nismoch puranos lepuranos. We're not going to conjoin these evil occurrences with those evil occurrences. So, what exactly is the connection, and why the nun? Why the upside down nun? So first of all, let's address the second question, the upside down nun. Certain Mefarshim, Sifsei Chachamim, the Balaturim, explain that the appropriate place for this verse would be back where they were. The Torah was describing the Aron and the travels, and that would be precisely 50 parshios preceding. Now, a parsha is not, sometimes refer to the portion of the week as the parsha, and sometimes refer to it as a sidra. But in the language of Chazal, a parsha is more like a paragraph. Over here, we're separated by white space. So this is a parsha, and this over here is a parsha, and this over here is a parsha. There's white space here, and there's white space. This is a tikkun. This is the way this is formatted, the way Sefer Torah is formatted. So a parsha is a segment or a paragraph, and the appropriate place for this, both thematically and chronologically, evidently, would be backwards 50 parshios. That's why the nun, which it equals 50 in its numerical value in Gematria, and so it's a nun, and the nun is backwards to indicate that the appropriate place of this section is really 50 parshios earlier. Now, Schwab asks a question, and he says, what exactly is, if you say puranios are punishments, we kind of waffled and said, well, they're punishments and they're bad things, and sometimes they are read as bad things, but typically in the language of Chazal, puranos is a payback such as to pay a debt, is called lifroa hachov, to pay back. So what's the payback? Where's the punishment? We see the punishment for the complaining that comes after this section. That is that the anger of God burns and eventually people die. But where's the punishment for saru mehar Hashem? That they left, as Tosfos quoting the Tanchuma says, it's paraphrased as Katino kaboreach mi beis hasefer, like a child that's fleeing the school. So Schwab says that in itself, the action itself is the punishment. Now, what's behind a tino kaboreach mi beis hasefer? What's behind a child that runs away from school? There's a feeling of, that's school, but I want to get back to life. There's a dichotomy between what I have to study and my life. I want to do what I want to do. Okay, I have to study. Okay, in this case, mitzvos, a lot of them, as Tosfos described. But let me get back to life. That's the phenomenon that's represented by Tinok haboreach mi beis hasefer. Tinok hayotze mi beis hasefer uboreach lo v'holich lo. Child, the bell rings, he's out of there. Now, what's the consequence of that? The consequence of not fully accepting the sometimes uncomfortable, burdensome yoke of Torah is a need to fill it with something. Rav Soloveitchik used to say on the passage concerning the sale of Yosef, it says that the brothers threw him into a pit, v'habor reik ein bo mayim. So Rashi says, which means the pit was empty, it had no water in it. So Rashi says, what do you mean? If it says it's empty, then I obviously know it didn't have water. So he says, no, it was empty of water. That's what habor reik ein bo mayim. The pit was empty of water. Avol nechoshim v'akrabim yesh bo. But it had snakes and scorpions. And Rav Aaron used to say, I heard this from him on a number of occasions. He used to say that what Chazal are teaching us is just like in the physical world, nature abhors a vacuum. Similarly, in the spiritual world, nature abhors a vacuum. There's no such thing as a life without values. You either have Torah values or you have values that are spiritual snakes and scorpions. So what happens when Bnei Yisrael are boreach? They flee the big school of Har Hashem, the mountain of God. So then they have to fill themselves with all kinds of things. Hisavu ta'ava. Rav Shaul Brach, quoting the Elshach, says, Hisavu ta'ava, they lusted a lust for food and for other things. So he says that the experience was so overwhelmingly spiritual that they really didn't initially have the taiva. They didn't have that lust, but they wanted the lust. Hisavu ta'ava. That's what they were looking for. They had to fill their lives with something. And so HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in dictating the Torah to Moshe Rabbeinu, says, put a separation between those, between the rushing away from the school of Mount Sinai to the lusting for lust, and put these psukim. What are these psukim? These psukim indicate the power of Torah. And when the Torah is raised up, Vahi ben Saron, Vayomer Shekuma Hashem v'yafutz oivecha, rise up, God, and your enemies will be scattered What are the enemies? The enemies are physical enemies, literally enemies, enemies who wish us harm, enemies who want to kill us, want to kill the Jews. And Chazal say that when it says oivecha, your enemies, it's referring to enemies of Israel. But there are other kinds of enemies of Israel, and those other kinds of enemies are spiritual enemies. So when we raise up the Torah, Kuma Hashem, v'yafutz oivecha, just put Hashem at the center of our lives and dig into the Torah, not like a child that's running from the big school, but like a more mature student who's carrying the lessons with him. And then uvnucho yomar, on the resting, when the Torah gently comes to rest, when the day is done, then it'll be restorative. It'll be Shuva Hashem Rivavos Alfei Yisrael. It'll be return, O God, the countless myriads of Israel. The Jews, when they follow the Torah, they have meaning. And when they don't follow the Torah, they have an infinitely unquenchable thirst for pleasures and other things that simply will not be satisfying. And the way to separate, the way to block that result is to revere the Torah and to study the Torah. To revere the Torah, to study the Torah, to imbibe the Torah, and ultimately to enjoy the Torah. Good Shabbos.